Hello, this Science of Sport video focuses on BTEC Sport and Exercise Sciences, Unit 2 Functional Anatomy and the muscular system. So this relates to learning aim E4 Antagonistic muscle pairs. Now, without doubt, for several of the exam questions, particularly question 12, you will need to be able to recognise and name some of the muscles of the body. You will absolutely need to know the proper names, where they are, and what action each muscle does when it contracts. However, this video focuses a little bit more on the roles that muscles might play in generating movement. We have multiple muscles contributing to movements in slightly different ways. The specification specifically requires you to understand the role, or these 4 different roles of muscles: agonist, antagonist, synergist and fixator. And I'd probably recommend that you learn at least one full example that enables you to explain these. So in its most simple terms, movement occurs because we have a joint. We typically refer to, certainly in the limbs, the long bones that connect or articulate at a joint. So this example is of the knee joint. This is the femur, this is the tibia, and this smaller bone is the fibula. In order for movement to happen at that joint, we need muscles to contract. We need muscular action. Now, hopefully already you know that muscles attach to bone via tendons. This white connective tissue represents the connective tissue that extends from a muscle over the joint and connects beneath the joint or on the other side of the joint. So it's really important you recognise that the muscles connect via the tendon on the other side of the joint. Now, tendons have a really important role. When a muscle contracts, let's look at leg extension, so increasing the angle at the knee joint or straightening the leg at the knee. When the quadricep muscles contract, they shorten, typically speaking, so they shorten, they pull centrally or upwards in this case, which pulls on the tendon attached to the quadriceps, which you can see actually is where this patella, this sesamoid bone is, and it attaches on this tuberosity here on the tibia. It's actually called the tibial tuberosity. So the quadriceps contract, pull on the tendon, which is attached to the bone beneath the joint, pulls on that bone, and you can see the result is extension at the knee joint. So again, sticking with this example, let's look at the 2 of the terms that you need to understand, 2 of the roles of muscles. If we are continuing to talk about leg extension, the quadriceps muscle effectively make that movement happen. They contract, they are the main muscles that create that movement. In this example, they would be labelled as the agonists. So they are the muscles that make the main movement happen. The agonist is also sometimes called the prime mover, which actually makes sense. The first mover, the main mover, the ones that make the movement happen. In order for this movement to be quite controlled, let's say, and for our lower limb not just to fly forward out of control, we have a partner muscle. So the first principle you need to understand is that skeletal muscles typically work in pairs. And this broadly is called antagonistic pairs, muscle pairs. So the quadriceps partner group is the hamstrings. So that the quadriceps are anterior on the front of the femur, and the hamstrings are posterior on the back of the femur. When quadriceps contract, they pull on this tendon, which creates extension, and you might already have figured out that when the hamstrings contract, they pull on this tendon, which attaches below on the fibula, and they create flexion at the knee joint. So these muscle groups, 2 muscle groups, work in partnership. They would be labelled as antagonistic pairs. One contracts to pull one way, one contracts to pull the other way. Please note that muscles only pull, they don't push. And in this context, we're mostly talking about concentric contraction, where when the muscle contracts, it shortens. There are variations to this, but that's for another video. Here's another very common muscle pairing. So on the upper arm, anteriorly, on the front of the upper arm, there is the biceps brachii. So you can see that it attaches to these processes, these protrusions or projections on the bone at the shoulder, on the scapulae, and also connects on the radius. So this actually goes over two joints. You can see it goes over the shoulder joint and goes over the elbow joint. But similarly to the previous example, when the biceps brachii contract, they typically contract concentrically, so the two tendinous ends get closer. In fact, while we're on this, the tendons actually attach in different places. In this example, the shoulder end of the biceps brachii is what we would call the fixed end, and these tendons are the origins of the muscle. So they are static, they stay there. This tendon attachment would be called the insertion, and this end is the end that will ultimately move and shorten when the movement occurs. So this is the origin, this is the insertion, the static fixed end or tendon, and the moving tendon end. So biceps brachii contract, they shorten, they pull on this insertion tendon on the radius, and which is attached to this the bone, of course, and flexion occurs at the elbow joint. And the partner muscle, of course, is the triceps brachii, which is posterior muscle. It attaches again on the scapula, and I can't quite see where the insertion is. It looks like it might be on the ulna, the larger bone there, the elbow bone, and this protrusion here. And when it contracts, it shortens. This is the origin, the fixed end. This is the insertion, the end that will move when the contraction happens, and it generates extension at the elbow joint. So as a broad rule, one muscle pulls one way, one muscle pulls the other way. As again, please be mindful there are exceptions to this which you have to be very cautious about. So here's just an overview. We've talked about already the agonist and the antagonist, or the prime mover as it's also known. And we will in a moment talk about the synergist and the fixator, these other roles that muscles may play. Here's some detail about the agonist and antagonist before we move on to those other two roles. These are the main bits that you definitely will need to be able to identify and describe in your question 12s. So the agonist or the prime mover are muscles that contract, typically shorten but not always, to create movement at a joint, also known as the prime mover. So they're responsible for the contraction and the movement. And then logically, the antagonist is the muscle that is responsible for allowing the movement by relaxing and lengthening, and it's called the antagonist. So in terms of this example, elbow flexion, the biceps contracting, pulling on the lower arm bones and creating bending at the elbow. The tricep muscles, you can see, are lengthened. Now, in order for this movement to be able to happen, they've got to be quite relaxed to be able to stretch and lengthen to allow the movement. If they were tense and contracting as well, we would have tension that way trying to pull. We'd also have tension that way trying to pull, and the movement wouldn't be able to happen. So in order for the flexion to happen, the biceps need to be able to contract, and the triceps, the partner muscle, the antagonist, has to lengthen and relax to allow that movement to occur. And in a way, it acts as a controlling muscle. So it won't just go completely slack, it will lengthen with control. We want this bicep curl, or this flexion, to be controlled rather than a really random, unsafe movement where we might damage our muscles. In other examples, you could consider it to be acting as a brake, again, a sort of a controlling movement, but that comes a little bit more with other examples. Ultimately, the antagonist tries to prevent random, fast, excessive movements and injury, so it controls and lengthens and relaxes to assist, to help. Now I just want to illustrate my warning. I tried to allude earlier to the fact that there are exceptions to the simplicity of a muscle. Let me just go back to the slide actually. If I go back to this slide, This is the simple version of it. Biceps contract, triceps lengthen. They're the agonist. The triceps are the antagonist. And then the movement the other way is they swap. They're the agonist. They're the antagonist. That's an incredibly simplistic view of this. If I come back to these examples, let me try to illustrate the exception to this. So let's look at a back bend or a back raise, an extended raise there. If you're laid on your tummy and you get into this position, you're actually contracting your gluteus maximus and your hamstrings to elevate the legs to create extension at the lower back and raise the legs off the ground. If you want to go from this position, this raised position, and lower your legs back down to lay them flat on the floor, it's actually not your abdominals that pull your legs down, because actually gravity is constantly trying to push your legs down anyway. You're having to work against gravity to raise them in the first place. So the extension movement is caused by these muscles contracting to pull the lower limb back up, the lower limbs up. But actually in lowering those limbs back down to the ground, it's again the same agonist muscles. It's still the quadriceps and the hamstrings gradually decreasing the force with which they're contracting to lower it down slowly. So they were the agonist to make your legs go up, but they're also the agonist controlling the weight of your limbs lowering against gravity. It's different from our previous example where one way it's that muscle and the other way it's the other muscle. It's different. Let me give you another example. Doing tricep presses with this weight behind your sort of head. So your triceps brachii contract to straighten your arms, to extend your elbow joint, to move the weight upwards. To lower it back down, it's your triceps again that act as the agonist to lower this weight against gravity with control. So the agonist is actually the same muscle group in the two directions of movement, particularly when there's a heavy load and particularly when the movement is up and down. Not always up and down. So here, pectoralis major doing the chest press, but to lower these dumbbells back down again, it's still the pectoralis major that acts as the agonist to slowly control them. We don't need back muscles pulling these weights down and pulling our arms out to the side, because gravity and the weight of these dumbbells is trying to do that constantly. We need these same muscles being the agonist in both directions. You may have been at the gym and been on these machines. The abductors, so the muscles on the outside of your thigh are abductors because they contract to pull your leg towards the side, away from the midline. And these are abductors, the inside of your thigh. This machine creates a resistance and you pull it in. Now, if we take the adductor machine as an example, those of you that have been on this, you know that you work your muscles, you make your adductors contract to move your legs both inwards towards the midline of the body, and then what the machine wants to do is make your legs fly outwards, but you have to really work to control them to get back to this position, this starting position. So your muscles work, the adductors are the agonists in adduction, the legs being pulled towards the middle, so your legs are together at the front of your body. But then you have to really work hard to control the movement going back apart. And it's the adductors that are the agonists in both directions. They contract concentrically to move the limbs inwards, and then they work eccentrically to control the movement outwards again. And we'll talk again in another video about types of contraction, concentric and eccentric. But all of these really, most of these are examples of how it's not necessarily the opposite muscles that are the agonist and antagonist. In these examples where there's a big heavy load and you must control movement, or where gravity is acting on the up-down movements, in these cases the agonist muscle in two different directions is the same muscle group. This forehand backhand is perhaps a contrasting example, because let's say in doing a forehand and this movement of the racket moving across the body is horizontal flexion, and it would be your pectoralis major that contracts concentrically to make that action happen. The antagonistic muscle would be muscles on your back, that, let's say, rhomboids, trapezius, they would be the antagonist in the forehand. Doing a backhand, where there's horizontal extension, it's your back muscles that are contracting as the agonist to pull the racket horizontally in the backhand stroke. So it would be your rhomboids, trapezius that would be the agonist, and in this example the pectoralis major are the antagonist. So this is an example of perhaps the normal swapping roles, and these are examples of where it doesn't always work that way. Okay, so we've talked through agonist and antagonist and how in many movements they do swap roles, and in some movements with load, heavy loads up and down against gravity, or sort of sprung, tense, the adductor abductor muscle machines, it's not always the case. Now let's have a look at synergists and fixators. So the agonist is the main muscle that generates the movement. So in a bicep curl, it would be the biceps brachii. We've done that, they're the prime movers. But synergists are actually helping muscles. They're a muscle or muscle group that assists the main muscle doing their job. So perhaps that's a nice easy way of remembering what the role of the synergist is. Synergists assist. Synergists assist. I can barely say it. Translated, it means work together. So synergists work together with the agonist to make the movement happen. So they assist the agonist to work more effectively, producing a movement. They're not able to do the movement themselves, but they help the agonist do the movement, sometimes controlling the specific direction of the movement. So they help make the movement happen. They're often located either side of the agonist, and perhaps this is a nice example to learn. The biceps brachii create flexion. The brachioradialis, which you can see again, does a smaller muscle group, attaches a bit lower down by the wrist and above the elbow joint, helps, assists with a contraction to make that movement happen. The other example here, sort of illustrated in this diagram and explained at the bottom here, is hip flexion. So reducing the angle at the hip joint. We've got this muscle here, iliopsoas, and where's the iliacus? It's not there. Iliopsoas is one of your hip flexors, so when it contracts, it's attached below the hip and above the hip on the pelvis. It will pull the femur upwards, and we have flexion at the hip joint. So the synergists in hip flexion, the muscles that assist iliopsoas, are rectus femoris and tensor fascia latae. So rectus femoris is this big quadricep muscle, and tensor fascia latae is this muscle up here. So this is the agonist, and these are synergists in hip flexion. Okay, I really recommend maybe you learn at least one of those as an example in case you need to explain it. Okay, so we've talked through agonist, antagonist and synergist, the assisting muscles. This is the fourth and final role that muscles might play, the role of a fixator. So basically fixators stabilize other muscles or joints to reduce any unwanted movement. If you're doing, let's say, a side raise, so you had dumbbells in your hands down here, you wanted to do side raises, you want the shoulder to remain sort of level and low, and you just want to move the arm. Now these muscles, so the rhomboids, the trapezius, big kite-shaped trapezius muscles, they will contract isometrically to keep your shoulder girdle as still as possible, so that you don't lift your shoulders up and elevate your shoulders. So these muscles are contracting, not to do with the movement at all, but to stabilize the muscles and the joints so that that movement at the arm, at the shoulder joint, can be isolated. Okay, so a couple of points. These do not make the movement happen. They don't help the movement happen. They stabilize and keep other body parts still so that the movements can be isolated. So the fixators are stabilizers of the joints. The contraction that they have is often isometric, i.e. there's tension, they contract, but they don't move, they don't shorten, they don't lengthen. Our agonist muscle shortens, our antagonist muscle relaxes and lengthens. Fixator and synergists will contract and shorten. Fixators contract but don't change length. It's an isometric contraction. So the example I just went through was actually this one here. So these trapezius, these back muscles, are fixators in arm movements, particularly with a heavy load, where the temptation is you use other parts of your body to help you. The other possible example you might want to think about using is doing leg raises. So you laid on the back. The temptation, if you were to lift your leg, would be for your pelvis to tilt forward and to lift forward. So tensor fascia later is the hip flexor in this example, so it works to pull on the femur to raise the leg. But your rectus abdominis, so that would be the agonist. So rectus abdominis is a fixator. You contract your abs isometrically to try to stabilize this trunk, this lower abdomen, to keep it still so that just your leg moves and your hip isn't lifted off the ground. Okay, again, I really recommend you remember at least one of those. So just to draw it all together, muscles don't work in isolation. Muscles help each other. Most muscles stabilize each other. They take on different roles in different movements. Here's one example that gives you each of those. Remember, agonist is the prime mover, the muscle that contracts to make the main movement happen. In this case, for a bicep curl, it's the biceps brachii. The antagonist is the partner muscle that, when the contraction movement is happening, will lengthen and relax to control or break and enable the movement to happen. The synergist is the assisting muscle. Synergists assist, and we could use brachioradialis as that example. And in this example again, the fixator could be trapezius. So your trapezius muscle on your back, or your deltoids for that matter in this diagram here, stabilize the arm movement so that we don't lift our shoulder or move our shoulder. It isolates shoulder movement so that movement only happens at the elbow joint. So please remember those and get the clarity of the different roles in place. Last thing just to go through, I mentioned it right at the start of the video. So we have different names for the sort of two ends of a muscle. So this is the muscle belly. These tendons attach at an end which remains fixed or still. This is called the origin. The muscle starts here. So that you could consider it the muscle starts here and attaches at the moving end. And this end would be called the insertion. So the origin is the tendon that attaches and does not move when contraction occurs. It's often the proximal end, the end that's nearest. The insertion is the tendon that attaches and does move when contraction happens. So when contraction of the biceps happens, this end is pulled nearer the body, nearer the shoulder joint, and it's usually the distal end of the muscle, i.e. the end that's further away. So we've gone through antagonistic pairs plus synergists and fixators. Here are muscle pairs that you will need to understand and connect together. Okay, so these are pairings that you will need to learn. You'll need to know what movements occur when they contract and where these muscles are, so that if you are presented with a diagram of a movement and you are asked to analyze the movement, you could give the muscles that created the movement in whatever plane it was in.